When I started to tweet criticisms of social justice and DEI and what I called liberal fascism, I was tweeting anonymously, but I was calling myself the anti-PC NYU prof. I thought to myself one day, if I start talking as an NYU prof, the things that I'm saying, all hell is going to break loose.
Right.
So she interviewed me. That interview appeared. 2 days later, I was coerced out of the campus, condemned by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Group. If you talk
Um,
about the free market and freedom and free speech, all of a sudden they call you a fascist.
You're listening to the Wired for Impact podcast.
my guest today is presidential candidate Michael Rectenwald. Michael is a former Marxist professor at NYU. You hold a Ph.D. in literary and cultural studies. You're a distinguished fellow at Hillsdale College. You taught at Duke University, Carnegie Mellon, published multiple essays across multiple outlets, as well as being on many media outlets as well. A speaker and author of 12 books, including The Great Reset, and one I'm going to be reading here shortly, The Google Archipelago. And as I mentioned, candidate for president of the Libertarian ticket. But of all those, I think the most recognized or celebrated history that you have is being banned from Twitter. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I got banned from Twitter. I now have a new account. I sort of inhabited somebody else's account. I'm sort of a body snatcher in there. So they can't do anything about that. So, but it was never brought back after Musk took over.
Yeah, I noticed that. I was a little surprised. I thought you might be one of the people that could have a little resurgence on there. We have plenty to talk about today. I think one of the most interesting things about your story and your body of work is your transition from very liberal Marxist perspective to now one being a huge advocate for decentralization and liberty for the people. So let's start with your Marxist connections and tell me a little bit about how you grew up and why was that ideology interesting and attractive to you?
Oh, that's a good question. So, yeah, I mean, I grew up in a large German American family on the north side of Pittsburgh. And I went to a seminary in high school at age 14, a Catholic seminary where we lived. Really, it was adjacent to a monastery there. And I became very studious there because there was nothing else to do. And, because we were in the middle of nowhere in the country. And so, it wasn't until, there was a lot of, I would say, subconscious or subliminal, really, Marxism coming out of the television, even in the 60s and 70s. And there was subtle indoctrination there, but I never really bit on it until I went to graduate school in my master's work at Case Western Reserve University and started to have all these Marxist texts basically funneled into you, but with very little relief. And you knew that if you didn't adopt some sort of leftism to become a professor in an English department, then you weren't going far. But it wasn't merely opportunism that really motivated me. It was the fact that it made some sense. It made some sense in terms of, well, I'd been in business for 9 years before I went to graduate school. And so, it sort of is a master narrative, as they call it, that sort of organized all kinds of things. And it gave you a sort of paradigm through which to look at the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it at the time rather convincing. I also thought it was ethical. I thought it was, the most ethical system or approach to the world that there was. And so I kind of gotten deeply into it, but I wasn't teaching Marxism at all at NYU or anywhere else. I simply did this as a kind of avocation and wrote in Marxist journals and things like that. But I wasn't really like a professor of Marxism per se. I was a professor of what they call literary and cultural studies, but I actually did my work in the history of science and its relation to culture in Great Britain in the 19th century.
This is what's so interesting to me is first and foremost, I don't think as a ideology, Marxism becomes this pervasive without there being some element of truth to it, if you want to call it that, or some, like you were talking about, it seemed ethical. And I think that's the slippery slope of it, is that it can become extremely destructive and people don't see it. And so while you weren't formally teaching Marxism per se, I would suspect it was very possible that the Marxist ideology within you was being distributed in the teachings itself, if we get into the nuance of it.
Well, here's the thing. When I taught at NYU in particular, and even before that, I actually tried to teach from like a multi-perspectival standpoint so that I would give students multiple perspectives on various topics and issues.
Mm.
So in some, one of them in terms of economics, yeah, one of them was Marxism, but I also taught neoclassical economics and things like that. So it wasn't, I tried not to proselytize. I thought that was not the place of the classroom. That's the place of like a party meeting or something like that. It's not, it wasn't I didn't think education should be spent promoting or proselytizing or indoctrinating students. Never thought that. So
Sure.
that was something that I didn't have to really kick.
That makes sense. I want to ask you a follow-up question to that, but first, let's define for those that are a little bit unsure, a little fuzzy about what Marxism actually is, so that there's some clarity there.
Yeah, I mean, Marxism calls itself scientific materialism, and that is to say, it is a materialist philosophy that posits that basically everything in the world follows from material conditions and relations. So everything follows from the fact that the material world generates everything, first of all. So it completely starts from that premise. It's materialist philosophically. And then it posits that the history of humanity is a history of class struggle. And it posits two major classes that come out of the feudal period and start to consolidate in the capitalist era. And that is the proletariat or the working class and the capitalist class or the bourgeoisie. And so there's a struggle between these two. And there's also a relationship in terms of production and such that it posits that the worker is exploited at the point of production, not in the consumer realm, but at the point of production, that there's a certain amount of labor that is done effectively for free. It's called the extraction of surplus value that is supposedly happening as the worker works. So Marx put it in terms of the workday. Maybe 4 hours a day, the worker worked enough to support himself, and the other 4 were appropriated by the capitalist. And that was the margin of exploitation. So it's premised on the labor theory of value. That is the idea that all value in the economy comes from labor, and that you can measure this value by labor hours, socially average labor time. So there's a conflict thesis right there. It's a conflict thesis between these two supposedly antithetical and opposite classes that have different interests at stake. And the way to overcome this dialectic is the resolution of the dialectic is for a classless society to emerge from that conflict.
As I mentioned before, there's threads of truth in that does become appealing because there is real oppression, there is real exploitation.
Yeah.
Where does this ideology fall apart then?
Well, it falls apart. This is interesting because this idea of class theory actually began not with Marxism, but with the Austrian School of Economics, and their configuration of the classes was this. It wasn't the capitalist versus the proletariat. It was the state versus the people. The state is the main exploiter in society. After all, who else can take your money without an agreement and effectively at the point of a gun? That's the state. And what other organization in society is a monopoly over force? That's the state. So the real conflict, there is a class conflict in society, but it's not a conflict between the workers as such and the capitalists as such. It's a conflict between the people and the state and its beneficiaries, those companies, corporations, individuals, industries that are in collusion or cahoots with the state, and they benefit particularly from this arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
So there is some truth, and there is exploitation. The exploitation comes from the state. It takes money from you without your consent, effectively. But also, there is other exploitation. There's kind of like a super exploitive working conditions that happen when you don't have evenly distributed capital accumulation. That is to say, when you have very industrialized regions and other regions that are under industrialized, then you get capitalists setting up shop in those regions and then exploiting the labor of those people, because what it is their labor's really, it's worth less because it's usually less skilled. So that's significant. But also, they don't have the capital base for a highly skilled labor to go on. And as such, they end up making pennies on the dollar compared to workers in the developed world. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the relationship between developed countries like the US and Western Europe and so forth, and like African countries, is one of colonialism and imperialism. So those are significant and real things, and they leave after effects. And that relationship is imbalanced, but it's not because of the capitalists as such. It's because of the relationship between the states in those places. Then there's other factors that come into why these countries don't develop. One of the reasons they don't get developed is that there's a kind of a collusion on the part of monopolists in the developed world that they don't want development going on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it becomes a territory that the regulation becomes a wall for free capitalists to make it more difficult to penetrate, and they can maintain their monopolies. In my mind, in a capitalist society, let's say that there are exploitations, you do need somebody to come in and help regulate. So there's a real need for regulation and some element of state integration. But in my opinion, where it starts to fall apart is when the state becomes less referee and more a player in the game, and now all of a sudden you don't have a ref to ref anymore. And so that's when the whole thing seems to implode on itself.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of differ with you a little bit about whether the state needs to be this arbiter between capital and labor. That's really why we have what we call, progressivism altogether. There was this belief that the relationship between workers and capital owners or capitalists was imbalanced, and it's really premised on the idea that the workers are being necessarily exploited when they go to work. But that's a false premise, though. So that whole thing is based on a false premise. So it turns out that the regulators actually end up benefiting the big capitalists and squelching the competitors, because regulations benefit the players that are already in the game. Yep. And they disadvantage other players, competitors.
Yes, I find it very ironic that oftentimes, and I've seen this firsthand, corporations, the regulations that are supposed to be applied are in name only. I mean, if you really get into it, it's very rare that those regulations, as a consumer, we have this belief that, if there's a certain seal on a product, this is an organic product, or that there is somebody that's looking over the shoulder of the manufacturer that's constantly making sure that's not always the case. And a lot of times it's very costly. And to your point, it keeps out the smaller guy from actually coming into the marketplace and offering goods and services. And it allows the bigger guy to afford to maintain his position as a primary manufacturer in a market.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about Marxism. One of the things where I'm seeing it most pervasive is in education and academia. I have struggled to try to alert people in academics. I have children in school, they're being taught, and I have not been able to really break through and have the administrators understand the riptide of wokeism that they're in. They have no bearing as to what's actually happening. This is what I was saying earlier too about the Marxism, and you as a teacher. I think there's a lot of teachers that are being used as tools in the Marxist swell. How do we awaken them? How do we help them see that this is a larger agenda here and not just an ethical trying to keep things fair, et cetera?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of ways to go about it. I try to go away about it in every way possible. This is very interesting what I've come to conclude about Marxism, actually, that it's actually these huge giant corporate players, they don't want a free market. They don't want laissez-faire. They don't want competition. So I think these huge players, in conjunction with the state or the government, if you will, they actually promote this because they benefit from it. It does a couple things. It promotes the idea of a monopoly, and it supports their belief in, well, it keeps a lot of people out of the competitive realm because it figures everything as exploitative and all that. And also, it gives people this a sense of defeatism, that there's no way you can advance in this society under these class conditions and all that kind of stuff. I actually succumbed to that a bit myself when I was a Marxist. I thought, well, there's no way I could, I was doing pretty good as a professor, but, I thought, my position in society and everything was fixed by virtue of the fact that I was kind of like a worker. Some Marxists scoffed at that when I would say I was working class, but the one way is to wake them up to the idea that this is actually in the interests of the biggest dogs in the game, the bankers and so forth. That's one approach. The other approach is that it's wrong, that their premises are flawed, and to show them how they're flawed. The third thing is, I think, is more structural and big scope. That is, I think biggest problem here is the fact that you have the state funding all these institutions. So you get all these people in these roles who are effectively statists. They're basically wards of the state, if you will. And they're rent seekers who don't work in the competitive realm. And they don't want competition, these people. I know this because that's why a lot of people become teachers and professors. They don't want to compete in an open, fair and free competitive marketplace. That scares the hell out of them. They don't want it. They want a secure sinecure that's handed to them. And so is to show them that. But I would say cutting all federal funding to these institutions would go a long way of getting different types of people into these jobs. And that would also, I think, affect the kind of ideology, the ideological promulgation that's happening in the institutions. If you had less statists in there, then they wouldn't be teaching this stuff. And there's a lot of stuff that's very subversive that's been introduced through the pedagogy, as they call it, pedagogical theory. People like Paulo Freire, that these teachers are raised on when they go through college and graduate school, if they go to graduate school, all this stuff, all these pedagogical approaches, a lot of them are deeply informed by Marxist thinking. So these people are they're being brainwashed into this stuff.
Right. So that's what I'm talking about. How do you break through that? I think a very real tactic that you spend a lot of time talking about is the diversity, equity, inclusion, and how that's infiltrated academia. Can you talk about how that has Marxist element in it and how that would eventually push towards a Marxist culture?
It's a translation of Marxism into identity terms. So so you always have in Marxism, you could look at it, there's an oppressor and an oppressed. So there's this dyad, this oppressor-oppressed dyad. So they drain this of its economic content and they put identity content in it. And this becomes a battle between the identity, the oppressor is now a certain identity group. That's white, straight males usually. And the oppressor, all the others. And so they believe that that's the struggle that's going on in the society. So you just have to show them that it's not the struggle. There isn't a particularly systemic structural disadvantage given to people of color or women at all. It's just not true. Not now. There was, of course, and those were all state policies. So I think you show them that particular construction, that configuration that they're looking at is just a false binary that's not, it's just not, it doesn't hold water. But in my case, how did I get out of it? I think might be illustrative in terms of how people break out of the spell. for me, it was really being traumatized by the left.
Yeah, tell your story about
Yeah,
how you got canceled.
yeah, when I started to tweet criticisms of social justice and DEI and what I called liberal fascism, when I started tweeting about that, I was tweeting anonymously, but I was calling myself the anti-PC NYU prof. And so a newspaper reporter thought, wow, this is unusual material, ideas and stuff that be coming from an NYU prof. And I realized that too, because I thought to myself one day, if I start talking as an NYU prof, the things that I'm saying, there's all hell is going to break loose.
Right.
So she interviewed me. That interview appeared 2 days later. I was coerced out of the campus, condemned by the diversity, equity, and inclusion group for saying the things that I'm saying now.
Mm-hmm.
Very many same things.
That it's fascinating to me, and I appreciate someone like yourself who still has the gumption to lean into truth, try to figure out what the truth actually is,
Yeah.
and not feel and not succumb to the pressure. Because I imagine you were put under immense pressure.
Oh, tremendous pressure, and not only pressure, but also they moved my office to a different department. They moved me to the Russian department out of my own department, isolated me, made me a pariah on campus, basically tried to make my life untenable there.
Mm-hmm.
And they made it very, very tough. So this kind of marginalized me, get me out of the way. That's what they wanted to do.
Did you ever
And
feel threatened physically?
yes,
Physical? Yeah.
yes. There was a case in which Antifa, whatever you want to call them, of New York, Antifa NYC, wanted to kill me. So that wasn't good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that keeps you awake at night, I'm sure.
If you talk about the free market and freedom and liberty to speak your mind and free speech, all of a sudden they call you a fascist and stuff like that.
Yeah, it seems a little ironic.
Yeah, because because they're actually they're the people that are actually violating people's rights. They're the people that are actually infringing on your right to life and I mean everything, just your freedom of speech. They're actually fascists. That's the irony. It's the most bizarre twist.
Yeah, it is. I've had somebody who was in Antifa on the program before,
Who was
and
that?
gosh, it's been now over
Is
2
it
years.
a Hispanic
Um,
guy?
yes.
Yeah, I know him. I forget his name too, but yeah, we
It's-
met and talked and stuff like that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, very, but again, it's like, and I see this with, professor like Brett Weinstein.
Hmm.
You see it in Russell Brand.
Hmm.
Some of these people, or even Bill Maher right now, where you see a liberal upbringing, but then
A break.
the break because they're feeling the fascism and they're going, hold
Yeah.
on, wait a second, this is starting to fall apart. But there's so many people that are still indoctrinated into that, and it's very
Oh
scary.
yeah, very heavy duty thing. It's like constant, nonstop, and it's like in the air you breathe. It isn't just like very explicit. It's kind of implicit, the kind of assumptions that are just taken for granted, and you can't question them. If you start questioning these things, all kind of stuff will start happening. It's incredible.
Yeah, and that becomes, in my mind, that's why it's very difficult to snap people out of it, because it seems very, there's an emotional element that people are aligned with and that they're
Hmm.
attuned to, and logic isn't going to break it. Trying
Mm-mm.
to logic alone, I think ultimately the logic shows the fallacy, but there seems to need to be an emotional element.
Hmm.
I'm
Yeah, I
getting a little
agree.
bit
Yeah.
psychological, but
Yeah, I think it's trauma actually is what works. But not you don't want to induce it on them, but what happens is the left induces it on each other. That's what
Mhm.
happened to me. So,
So let's talk about your book about the Great Reset. I was astonished to see just yesterday, actually, somebody mentioned the Great Reset, and there was multiple people saying, "Well, what's the Great Reset?" I'm like, "Oh,
mm,
so many people are
mm,
still not tuned into what's actually going on." So,
mhm.
for my audience, can you please describe what the Great Reset is, and then what your book is about on that?
Sure. So the Great Reset is a project launched by the World Economic Forum in roughly 2021. But really, it goes back further. But the point of the Great Reset is to reset the world system altogether, the economy, the governance, government, the relationship between technology and people to the point where, a complete technological surveillance society is established. And also, it's really much hinging on this climate change business to reset the economy and to bring about actually the Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So the World Economic Forum basically signed an agreement with the UN that the World Economic Forum would help accelerate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals of the Agenda 2030. So that's what it is in short. And the Agenda 2030 is about restructuring everything and having total control over everything, like all production, all transportation, all consumption of meat, all kinds of things, consumption, production, everything. So they really want to have a complete system whereby they have complete control over everything that you do in terms of what you make, how you make it, what you eat, what you can do, whether you can drive, all these kinds of things. Gas, so-called fossil fuels, whether you can burn those. And all that is to reach the sustainable development goal. It's also a kind of redistribution scheme where they're trying to bribe the third world not to develop by giving them money transfers from the developed world to the developing world to make sure they don't develop. Because then they would become carbon emitters, So they want to reduce that. Plus, there's a population agenda in it too. The UN has been since its inception and middle of the 20th century has been trying to control population. They don't want population growth. They want a reduction in population. So it's a Malthusian, that is a population control project.
I'll say I wanted to talk to you about this a little bit later in the conversation, but since we're on that topic, do you think that there is a spiritual element to this? Because that seems very dystopian.
Yeah, there is. I mean, it depends. I don't go there in the book, but I think it's all underwritten by, first of all, these people think they don't believe in God. So the reason I think they don't want to believe in God is because they want to play God. So you have to first get out of the picture the idea that there's any kind of superintendence over the universe and particularly human beings by God in order to have the hubris to take on these kinds of projects and believe that you can be the master social engineer of the whole society. That takes a real lot of arrogance and hubris, and this throws out the idea of God. So in any sense, it's very atheist at base, except that this kind of also an apotheosis of these people into gods in their own minds. Some Christians would interpret that as kind of like antichrist. And I don't go there in the book. I mean, I have my own thoughts on it, which I don't want to go there too much. But there's definitely spiritual in the sense that these people have a particular creed that's materialist, that like Marxism is materialist, atheist, and social engineering based.
Would you say that capitalism is materialist as well?
Not really. I mean, see, so capitalism only deals with matter in the sense that it's not concerned about anything else. There's a difference between like a methodological materialism where you just basically, in terms of what you're doing, the extra material or supernatural just doesn't matter. And so you're not atheist, you're more like agnostic with reference to it in capitalism. But under Marxism, it's different because they are explicit, like the Soviet Union was explicitly an atheist state. So you have to banish the idea that there's anything but matter in order to be a Marxist, mostly. I've known one Marxist who thought he was also a Christian, but and a fundamentalist. It was bizarre, but there aren't many of these out there. But with capitalism, it's not really, it's a kind of a methodological, not a philosophical materialism. It doesn't say anything about whether there's any God or anything like that. It just operates at the level that it does and doesn't have any say on the rest. Now, I think Marxism is a philosophical materialism. It says there is nothing but matter. And likewise, everything derives from matter, and spirituality, Christianity, belief in God, theism, all that as Marx called it, the opiate of the people. It was just an ideological stupor that people were put in. That's what he thought of religion.
That's so interesting. I haven't thought of it that way. Whereas I think people typically think of capitalists as very materialistic. You think of
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
luxury houses and the cars, et cetera.
Yeah,
But that it's really more a byproduct of capitalism as opposed to an integration in the
right.
core philosophy of the paradigm itself.
And that's true. And then I also say that between Marxism and like materialist socialism and capitalism, capitalism is actually more compatible with Christianity in the sense that first of all, it doesn't explicitly disavow the supernatural or anything like that. Secondly, it relies on the freedom and free will. It believes in and posits the idea that there is freedom in the world and you need it. So that's very much in line with Christianity, where it posits the idea that free will, human beings have free will and they should be allowed to exercise it within moral bounds. But the Marxists think everything's determined. You
Mhm.
don't have freedom at all. You don't have free will. That's all. It's all determined by your material conditions, you see.
Mm. Yeah, that's a pretty big distinction.
Yeah.
What do you see as the biggest threat to freedom and independence?
Well, I think it's ultimately the state and everything that it does. But I think there are a lot of wrinkles to that. I do think that ideology and the way it is perpetrated and the extent of it and the propaganda and all that, I think that's how the state maintains its grip and its infringements on rights, on liberty. So I would say, you know, like in the immediate sense, I would say that we're looking at a system that, like tied back to the Great Reset, the idea that they want to basically control everything you do. And this is kind of endemic in the whole global system now. It isn't just coming out of the World Economic Forum and just floating around. It's actually being adopted by in the UN. It's actually being adopted as state policy all over the world. And this is major infringements of liberty are being enacted. So, these NGOs, they produce the content that the states actually then pick up and appropriate and make into law or policy. And that's significantly frightening. That's a very liberty infringing ideology coming out of these camps, like
Hmm.
these NGOs, like the World Economic Forum and others. It's also part of this is their anti-national sovereignty position. They want to get rid of national sovereignty for a big giant global hegemon that has no outside. There's only one state. They want a world government. So in a world government, the state now can be much more intensive and coercive because you have no escape. When you have many different nations, at least you could immigrate somewhere, but there's no immigrating unless you get on Elon Musk's rocket to Mars. There'll be no way out. So the bigger the state, the more dangerous it is. So that's globalism is ultimate threat.
Yeah, well, and as far as control goes, let's talk about the digital tyranny and the noose
Hmm.
that's tightening with
Hmm.
that. You talk about Google being a Marxist company.
Yeah, Google Marxism. Yeah.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Well, I forget kind of how I got to that. I think I got it through what's his name? It's a book After Google, where he used the phrase Google Marxism, but he didn't use it in a way that I thought was actually complete. He just referred to it as Marx posited that capitalism and industrial capitalism was the last stage of development, but the digital world proved that that was not true. So he says it's Google Marxism because Google and company posit the idea that the digital is the final frontier, where he says blockchain supersedes it.
Mm.
That being said, I think the reason I call it Google Marxism is that these companies are actually promoting implicitly and somewhat explicitly socialist ideas and controlling the public under a socialist rubric or a Marxist type rubric. It's implicit and also explicit in their policies and so forth and in their policing of opinion on the web and their total control of information that Google really has. I mean, they have almost a stranglehold on what you can get to. So they're not just a search engine, they're actually a reality manipulator. They're a curator of reality. And that's a very dangerous position to put in for any company to be in over us. And in that sense, it becomes totalitarian. And that's where it resembles Marxism. And also they have the values of, far leftism. And, just for example, on like YouTube's policies, you could be a Maoist and say all this thing about killing capitalists and stuff like that, but you can't say a word about a certain identity category. So that shows you that they actually believe that Marxism is purely innocent, that it's never done any wrong in the world. Only thing that's evil comes from the far right. So they always police the far right, but they never police the left. They're let them do anything. I've seen videos on YouTube, Maoist videos, where they're calling for slaughter of capitalism and capitalists. It's unbelievable. So they have no policies against it.
Yeah. Oh, they talk about assassinating Trump left and right, and there's never any pullback on that.
Right. Only thing they go after is far right. What Nazism, alt right, whatever they call it. Neo-Nazism, and
Well, what's funny about that is when you're in the relative sane middle, a little bit left of center, a little bit right of center, you are far right to a far leftist. So and this is what I always laugh when they say the far right. It's like, from your perspective, way out on the plank of leftism that you're teetering on, falling into the abyss. From your perspective, yeah, center ground is far right to you.
Right.
But we all think that they're talking about a left-right paradigm and the far right from the center.
There's a big controversy in the history and in the analysis of Nazism and particularly and also especially Mussolini's fascism, that it actually comes out of the left. Particularly Mussolini's fascism. He was a socialist. He was a major socialist editor and publisher. And then he morphed socialism, Marxism, into fascism. Similarly, you could say that there's some elements that come out of Marxism in Nazism. In fact, there's the same class and the same class categories are maintained. It just becomes the Jews, for the capitalists, not the capitalists becomes the Jews. So there's the same class resentment that they hold. They just morphed it into a different categories or stuck different content into the same structure.
Yes. I'm so glad you brought that up, because it makes it seem like it's new information, but it really fundamentally is the same thing. On that note, can you share your perspectives on critical race theory and why that is really tied to Marxist?
Yeah. Just going off of what we were just talking about, critical race theory has the same sort of oppressed dyad and that Marxism does. Was they just replace, instead of the capitalist class, it becomes whiteness and black people. Instead of exploitation, it's oppression. And like Marxism, it's considered systemic. That is, it's pervasive and structured into the society. It isn't just about attitudes of individuals. It's in like the very marrow of the system. And even when there's no racist around, or they can't find one, it's still racism, So it's very much like Marxism. It has that same notion that the racism is structurally existent rather than simply an attitudinal thing of individuals. You can't escape it. Yeah.
That to me is the breakdown of Marxism, because there are women who have been oppressed. There are black people who have been oppressed. There are these individual instances where those people have been exploited. And sure, of course, there have been men and white people as well. But in those individual instances, in a free society, those become individual cases. But in Marxism, that becomes systemic, to your point.
It's systemic. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
that to me is the fundamental
breakdown. You could say that
breakdown.
slavery was systemic in the South, for example. It was a system, right? But what's the solution to that? The solution to it is that you recognize and honor and protect the idea that every person owns themselves first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
Self-prop ownership of oneself as their self-ownership. That's the key of libertarianism, by the way. In my book of libertarianism, that is how I see it. And everything else follows from that. The other thing about this critical race theory is you can't ever get rid of it. So you can't get rid of racism. It's always there. No matter what you do, it's going to be there. So it's a self-perpetuating ideology. And this keeps a lot of people in business as well.
Right.
Because if you got rid of racism, what happens to all these departments that are established to fight it?
That's a
It's
great
an
point.
industry. Yeah.
Yes. And yes.
Academically, scholarship wise, it's a total scam. I mean, it's garbage. It's not scholarly. It's not historically accurate. It has no basis in like rigorous structural or even historical thought. It's just a lot of jargon that people plug and play and throw around. So it is scholarship wise, it's a total sham.
Of all the people on the planet, I feel like you have a pretty credible perspective to share that opinion. I hope that lands with people.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears
Thank
a little bit into your candidacy. What are you primarily running on? Why is a Rectenwald ticket the one that people should be voting for?
Well, the idea of my campaign is not like, if I were elected, I'll go in and fix everything. That's not going to happen, and that's not how things will get fixed. The idea is not even fixing things. The idea is to take the power that is vested in this giant, unbelievably mammoth-like central government and to get it away from the central government and allow freedom at the local level. So it's a campaign based on localism and decentralization, wresting power from these. The closer governance is to the people, the less oppressive and exploitative it is. The further away it is, the more exploitative and oppressive. So when people are closer to their governance system, whatever it might be, they have more impact on it. I think the idea is eventually there'd be no structural state as such. There'd always be governance, but governance by virtue of people in a cooperative society exchanging goods, making production exchange and recognizing the rights of others. And that's a system. There'll always be deviants, of course. There always will. There's going to be deviants out there, and this libertarian society deals with them in a way, but it doesn't set up a whole infrastructure to incarcerate all these people that, the state likes to keep in its prisons. But I think that, getting rid of arbitrary laws, getting rid of all this, basically increasing the scope of liberty, the breadth and the expanse of liberty in individuals' lives. That's what I'm running on.
You're one of the few candidates that talk specifically about, in my mind, drilling down to the root of a lot of the malfeasance that's been pushed out into our culture and our society today comes from the economic structure that we're under. And you're one of the few candidates that I have seen that speaks specifically about ending the Fed and abolishing, let's say on your website regarding inflation, you say stopping inflation at the source by auditing and abolishing the Federal Reserve and allowing legal alternative currencies like gold, silver, Bitcoin, and Monero.
Yeah.
Share a little bit more about your perspective on that. Why is it necessary to end the Federal Reserve?
Well, the Federal Reserve of course, has a money monopoly. And I don't believe in any monopolies. All monopolies are actually extremely bad for people. And so what they have is a monopoly over production of fiat currency. That is currency that has no basis in value. There's nothing of value backing it, only the word of the state. That's it. And they have the ability to produce it out of thin air, as Ron Paul used to say, out of thin air. They're making it out of nothing, then loaning it to the state on interest. So imagine if you could create a completely imaginary product and sell it and loan it to people with interest. It's incredible. It is the biggest scam ever perpetrated. And then they create economic problems. They create the boom bust cycle. They create inflation. So what I say is that short of getting rid of it, which would take an act of Congress and the Senate, we need to practice. And well, first of all, we need to get rid of legal tender law so that other currencies become legal. And then we can undermine the power of the Fed to be as a money monopolist by virtue of having real competitive currencies in the marketplace. So if people, a community, a network want to use Bitcoin, they should be legally able to do so. Things like that.
Hmm. You talk about there's the Great Reset, but you talk about the Great Refusal, which is, I think, brilliant. You talk about how globalists rely on the consent of the exploited. First and foremost, people need to wake up and realize that they are being exploited. But you have a 9-point plan for stopping the Great Reset.
Yeah.
One of which is refusing the central bank digital currency. Why is
Yeah.
that necessary?
Well, the central bank digital currency is like, we got to get out ahead of this. It's the next wave of totalitarian control that's being posited as some benefit to us. It'll be a total nightmare. It will take away your financial freedom entirely. Basically, you have an account with the Fed, which will be transparent to them, and they could control spending, what you can sell, what you can buy. They'll have a complete surveillance over your financial transactions, and they can flood the market digitally with CBDCs by putting some here, some there to favored players, which they do anyway now, but real instantaneously. They could flood markets, they could deprive markets, they could totally distort the marketplace altogether and create the kind of market they want, and to the benefit of them and their accomplices. So that's a terrible prospect, and so we need to make sure we don't buy into it.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yep. Speaking of not buying into things, your second point here is rejecting Internet of Bodies technologies, the installation of devices in your body, the metaverse, and transhumanism. That is so scary, and again, still not really on people's radar yet.
No. I'm trying to, yeah,
understand.
and those points, I'm getting ahead of some of the things that they're trying to do. The Internet of Bodies is simply a data tagging of basically your organs and organ systems, and this would datify your entire organic processes and make it available to central databases. It also could involve that main organ, I think, the brain, and in which case they could actually install, and this is very, look, Neuralink, Musk, for all his good points, put it that way, also has this Neuralink project, which is called brain computer interfacing. The next step up from brain computer interfacing is brain cloud interfacing, where your brain is effectively on the cloud. And this would make inputs and outputs into your brain possible. So you'll be putting out things that would go onto the cloud, and they could have cloud originating. The cloud could have impact on actually what goes into your brain. So this could control behavior to an unprecedented degree and actually undermine even the idea of free will. Noah Yuval Harari has said that free will is over. He's a consultant basically with the World Economic Forum. He said, humanity is hackable. We can hack you, and we could control you through this. So it's kind of like a remote control system that could be possible. So we gotta. I mean, all these things sound crazy, but so if we looked at what's happening today, if we try to anticipate them 20 years ago, we say, "Oh, that's crazy. That ain't gonna happen."
Yeah.
But and then there's some other things in there. The digital identity, which is a database about you that's connected to the CBDC. That's actually, according to the Bank of International Settlements, necessary for instituting the CBDC. That has to be resisted too, because that's a complete record of all your behavior from cradle to grave, at least for newborns, and from the point of introduction on everybody, including things like your vaccine status, you could include a social credit score, an ESG score, and so on and so forth.
As we're winding down on time a little bit here,
Yeah.
I think it's important for sure for people to have the Great Refusal. We need to not consent to the globalist agenda. On the other hand, what are we pointing towards? What is the alternative target? Can you please paint a picture of what a Rectenwald version of that target looks like?
Yeah. Okay. So as opposed to what they want to do is total control and centralized power and centralized knowledge, I believe in distributed knowledge and distributed power, distributed economics. So I think a distributist idea where you have more like nodes of production and kind of like cottage industries now, high tech, digitalized and blockchain sort of cottage industries, all producing things without central control imposed on them, without this kind of surveillance system, basically a grid that's not overseen by like a master hand, or by a master eye, if you will. So we would incorporate technologies into this, but they wouldn't be used as they are being proposed to be used by these techno tyrannists. They were looking at techno tyranny. They look at all these technologies as a way to get absolute like power over everything in the world. Whereas I'm saying the technology can be used to liberate us from their oversight and their control. So I look at it, I'm looking at distribution, decentralization, localization, and a voluntary society where everything is voluntary. There isn't any compelled production. There's no compelled consumption. There's no, restrictions on all these things imposed by the regime as such. That's the vision I see. And I think getting them out of the picture, getting the state out of, removed at least from the pictures, pushing it back would give us more wealth and freedom at the same time. We would have comparatively a kind of cornucopia, not a utopia. There's nothing utopian about freedom, but it's definitely much more conducive to creating wealth and prosperity for the vast majority and increasing real social welfare as opposed to government and dictated or distributed social welfare.
Michael, thank you so much for your time today. Of course, for those that are interested in learning more about your candidacy, the issues, and then, of course, just the enormous body of work that you have spent a lifetime now at this point, creating, which is so beneficial to society. I really appreciate all the brain power that you've put into it because it's pretty overwhelming to see. But for those that are interested, you can go to rectenwald2024.com to check out Michael's
That's the campaign site. Yep.
Campaign.
And then if you want to know about my production and stuff, my personal business website is michaelrectenwald.com. Yeah.
Yes. And then you're not on Twitter? Or at least
yes, I am. I'm on Twitter. Handle is my campaign slogan at Wreck the Regime, RECTEHE, Wreck the Regime.
Is that where you're most active?
Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, Michael, thank you again for your time and for sharing your wisdom today.
My pleasure, Peter. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Wired for Impact. If you're interested in creating and expanding your impact, be sure to visit us online at impactnow.com.